Okay, welcome back to this very spooky edition of the Software Circus. Before we get into the panel, which is one of the sessions I've been looking forward to the most today, I just want to give another shout out to our sponsors. That's Equinix Metal, Cycloid, Giant Swarm, Instana, and Kinfolk. If you go into the Brella app, you'll be able to find their booth there, where I believe they will have scary gifts and fun things to do. Okay, now it's time for the first and only panel session of the day, entitled Your Worst Moments in the Cloud. It's probably a little hard to tell who everybody is apart from me and possibly Sam at this moment, but let's just start with a quick round of introductions from my right. So that is hockey mask face first.
Right. My name's Anne Currie.
You want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Anne?
So I have been in the tech industry for... Am I okay? I think
there's an echo. Yeah.
An echo.
It's stopped now.
That's good. I've been in the tech industry for about 25 years now, working in a variety of things, and I am currently a lecturer in tech ethics at the University of Hertfordshire, and I am on sabbatical from Container Solutions, writing a series of hard science fiction novels.
Very nice, thank you, Anne. Okay, next along, for me at least, is a slightly more recognizable member of the panel. Sam, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Sam. I've come as the ghost of Unix programmer past, which is because I used to be a Unix programmer 20 years ago. I also want to alert you to the fact that I am stationed quite close to a lit candle of a pumpkin, and this is fake spider's webs. There's a very good chance I don't see the whole panel out. I now spend a lot of time talking about distributed systems and microservices and try and stop people doing it. And that's my thing, really. So it was nice knowing you all anyway.
Great. If you could just quickly Slack me your address, I'll dial 91, and then I can dial the extra one when the flames start, and we'll get the fire brigade around there. Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, moving again to the left. Big dark eyes, scary mouth.
Hey, I'm Rain. My pronouns are they, them, by the way. I am a developer advocate with Equinix Metal. So funny story, my partner said, "How are you still employed?" when he saw me dressed up today. And I said, well, my boss's boss is dressed as a vampire, so I think I'm good. I've been in the tech industry for 20 years. I've been in the cloud industry for 7 years, and I've been in open source for 12. I'm having a lot of fun, and I can't believe I'm being paid to dress like this. I love my job.
Nice, thank you, Brian. Okay, and then last but by no means least, pig's head.
Yeah, serial killer pig as my kids like to call it. Hey everybody, I'm Bryan Cantrill. I'm the CTO of Oxide Computer Company, a venture-backed startup in Silicon Valley, building a computer. Prior to that, I was at a cloud computing company, Joyent, for 10 years, and prior to that at Sun Microsystems for 14. So I guess I've been around the block, and I've got some horror stories along the way. So looking forward to talking about them.
Great, thanks, Brian. And I'll introduce myself quickly. Mark Coleman. Obviously, I'm your host for the whole conference today. I'm Director of Developer Relations at Equinix Metal, and some of you will know me from the work I've done with the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So, jumping straight into it, I've got a few themes, but we've got 55 minutes to go, so this could be fairly meandering. But since the title of this is nightmares, all around nightmares and bad situations from the past, I was wondering, maybe if some of you could share some of your either cloud or software-based nightmares from the past to kick us off.
God, so many. It's hard to know where to start. I know we are trying to get to kind of the confluence of probably people-based nightmares as well as technology-based nightmares. Certainly, one of my worst outages was one where a database started trying to delete itself, due to a long cascade of problems that involve many different technologies, all operating across purposes. And the engineer responsible for, and so everything is down. And I know that this database is trying to delete itself. A massively replicated database is trying to delete more or less all of its replicas. And I view my job as to prevent my CEO, a very reasonable person, I should say, but my job is to occupy the CEO to allow the technologist to fix this, because I knew that there was nothing that he nor I could do other than not trying to screw it up anymore or raise stress levels any higher than they were already raised. And I went into his office, closed the door, and I told him, my job is to keep you in the office here. And he said, no, I know that. And I'm like, you know, yeah, I'm sure you know how serious it is. He said, no, I know all of this. And it felt very existential for us. And I just wanted to get him to appreciate it without losing his mind. And he's like, look, you got to have some faith in me. I'm in here talking to you and not out there screaming or crying. Okay. So it was definitely, it was a nightmare. It was a very vivid nightmare on all sorts of levels. And it was a nightmare in part because we were in a larger organization that had turned fear-based, which makes things, it definitely heightens all of the nightmares when we are organizationally fear-based.
Thanks, Bryan. I think for all of these stories, we're going to see that there's an organizational and personal aspect to them, and I'll probably come back to some of those later. But for now, let's keep it light and just talk about things blowing up. Any other stories anyone would like to share?
Yeah, I could go next. I was working for a startup that delivers kind of goods to local corner shops or bodegas. So you order your milk, tobacco products, and they'd be delivered to you next day. And we had just rolled out a system that used a JBoss message broker to send messages between these services running on the back end, and it fell over. And we had lost all the orders for that day. And that basically was our busiest day of the year. And if we was busiest day of the week, and if we lost those orders for that day, we were going to go bust as a company. And so the orders cutoff point was 11 o'clock in the morning. And at 11:30 in the morning, we had to send all of our orders to our suppliers to get them to send product to our warehouse so we could distribute it and have it delivered the next day. And basically every single order that had got placed had just vanished. It had gone. It had absolutely gone. I had no record of it at all. And so I had put the message broker in and I had pushed for it. And at this point I think the phrase is squeaky bum time. So it was definitely squeaky bum time. And I was worried, but I started digging around in the logs just frantically, and I'm trying to work something out. And I realized that we'd left some old debug messages in our logs because we changed how the basket worked. And so we had a record, whenever someone put something in their basket, we had a debug statement in there. So we thought, well, look, we didn't have a debug statement when someone took something out of the basket, though, only when they put it in. And so what we did is we just made an assumption that everybody who had put something in the basket had bought something that day. And so I had to write a program. This is when I fell back on my love of sed and awk. I wrote a program that basically took the application logs and stripped out the SKUs and the quantities being added in from each log line and converted that into a database insert statement and directly inserted the line items into the database. And we ended up sending out more stuff than we should, but the company was saved. And once again, I realized that sed and awk are the best things in the entire universe, and that message brokers are not to be trusted ever under any circumstances.
High praise for message brokers. Okay, thanks, Sam. Any other technical nightmares?
This is from quite a long time ago, and this kind of predates the cloud, but it's a general thing. And I don't know whether this happens so much anymore, because this is something that affected me when I was a young developer. This was back in the 90s, and I was working for one of the biggest tech companies. I won't say who they were. And we had one of our customers was one of the biggest American banks, and I won't say who they were either. But we had a terrible problem with a bug in the software that was running on every single one of their ATMs. and their ATMs all over America were going down like crazy with this problem. And we were really struggling to find out what it was. I mean, it was a, this isn't a cloud problem, but fundamentally it's a problem. And it doesn't really matter whether it's running on the cloud or it's running on data centers operated by whoever or individual machines, whatever. It was a complicated distributed system. And generally problems can be resolved. You'll turn on your diagnostics, you'll find your problem. Eventually you'll find the problem. The horror is usually how long that might take and who's going to get incredibly angry in the time between the problem occurring and the problem being fixed. And I don't know if this is still such an issue now, but in the 90s, a lot of senior folk at companies started to realize that the people they talked to about problems that happened were often salesmen or quite senior folk, and they often felt they were getting the wool pulled over their eyes. So that there became a bit of a thing for asking more and more junior developers within the organization to get up in front of the board of those companies and explain things, because they really wanted to find someone who was too naive to be able to hold to the company line. And I remember, and in this particular thing, I was the most junior developer on the team. I must have been about 24 at the time. It was quite a long time ago. And I ended up having to get on a phone call and be berated by the board of this major American bank because I was the most junior person they could get hold of and didn't think that I would be able to tell a tale to them. That isn't really true.
You are more than capable of telling a tale.
I'm more than capable of telling a tale, but it was my scariest moment in, it was the first time I'd really had to. We did fix it eventually, but these things just take quite a long time to fix.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting sensations when these things go down is just the emotional response of like the oh fuck. I remember one where I was I'm going to totally anonymize the story. I was working at a company and I had to make, let's say, a change to a server. I'm going to really anonymize this one on a Friday night, but I'd forgotten that and I'd already gone to the pub. So I was like, damn it. It's like 10 p.m, half cut. And I get there. Oh, would you like to join? Yes, we have a guest. Jamie's here. Hello, Jamie.
Hello, hello,
there
hello. That's Anne, isn't it?
It is Anne.
Hello, Anne.
Right, go on then. Bugger off. Yeah. So I get there and I'm okay. I'll just get my laptop out and I'll fix this. So there I am, SSH into this machine, and I'm playing with something on IP tables, and everything stops working. And suddenly I'm like, oh, I've IP tabled myself out of port 22. That is now an issue. I'm going to have to go to the office. Drunk, pretend not to be drunk, hope that no one's there, and then go and fix this. And just that moment of, it's like realizing you've locked yourself out of your house. There's no real way back now without massive inconvenience. Anyway, so staying on the technology track for a moment, Rain, would you like to contribute a story, or should we move into the organizational and emotional?
No. I don't know if you all know. You may have heard of this technology, OpenStack. And I joined OpenStack on the Mitaka install, which means it was just before the installers got smooth. So there was a good 3 months period of severe imposter syndrome and doubting myself until I finally was in the right place at the right time, and a senior engineer turned to me and said, look, the longer you're here, the more you'll realize nobody knows anything. Relax. Now, I will admit, hearing that, being told that was perfect timing. I was about to set a house on fire, burn a building down, throw a laptop out a window. But also after that, the installer did get a lot better. It wasn't in Mitaka. It was a couple of installers later, but it was enough. Getting that phrase was perfect. And I ended up on OpenStack for 5 years. I just recently left. And it's true. The more you know you don't know.
The absolute root of imposter syndrome. So, fantastic stories to kick us off. Now, a lot of the talks we're hearing today at the Software Circus are all about avoiding things like this, right? And it seems like a lot of these technological talks and practice talks are all about how do we avoid this? But of course, we're never going to reduce the number of nightmares to zero. And I think what's quite interesting is how organizations respond to problems. On the one hand, there could be this very sort of welcoming, like, oh, problem is an opportunity to grow kind of approach, which I think we see in some measures in some places. I think what I've seen more of in other places is, okay, how do we fix this before anybody finds out? Now, I think this goes quite deep into the organizational culture. Do any of you have any experience with either of those extremes, or perhaps moving companies or teams across those extremes, either from good to bad or from bad to good?
Actually, I've got, I'm going to go first, and I'm going to come out of a couple of closets and admit a couple of things. I normally go with a company and I stay for at least a year. That's my kind of MO. I think that in that first year, you find out a lot about a company, but there was one company that I jumped to that I am also going to anonymize. There was one company I jumped to that I was desperate because I had just been laid off. The company I'd been with before had gone under. And so I jumped to a new company without really researching. And it was a tiny company with high turnover and outsourced employees, most of them. And I was one of the few in-source. And it didn't take long for me to realize that it was not a safe space for anything, for opinions, for mistakes, for bugs, for anything. The owner used to say things like, I don't care what anyone else says, I think you're okay. But jokingly, so that if you called him on it, he's just kidding. This is not like it was in the 80s. This was where people should know better. So I start looking for new work, and suddenly I realized that he has set up my non-compete so that I can't work as a developer for any technology company for 6 months. And I understand non-competes because you don't want to steal customers and whatnot, but this was so strict that I would have been unemployed for 6 months. And so I decided to see if I could make it go away. And one day when everyone in the office was out to lunch, except him, hacking used to be physical, and that's what I did. I physically broke into the secretary's desk, grabbed my non-compete, and made it disappear. And it turns out that there was no cloud, or at least no shared network, and no electrical backups of any documents whatsoever. So it just disappeared. Bravo. And suddenly it's one of the hardest things I've ever done at work. And I've done a lot of hard things. And shockingly, when my next job came along and I needed to put in notice, he then noticed that it was missing. And it was a really good opportunity with a really big company. And he was mad and wanted to make that stop. And within hours of that notice, he said, your non-compete seems to have disappeared. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Nope.
I'm just feverishly typing into Google statute of limitations here, right? All right. Well, that's quite the story to kick us off with. I mean, we went deep, fast. Okay. Does anyone want to follow up on that one? Actual perjury, possibly fraud.
Well, I think, we, by means of an acquisition, whenever you are acquired, cultures can shift. And I think one of the challenges that we had is after an acquisition, trying to preserve one culture inside of another is a real challenge. And, we had, you're talking about, what is an organizational disposition towards a failure. And you really do need to embrace and learn from failure. And you need to enshrine that idea. I mean, you don't want to be so failure-philic that you don't also build a reliable service. I mean, you don't want to, and this is the tension, right? I mean, on the one hand, it's never good news when a system fails. But on the other hand, you need to fully understand it. And what I've kind of come to is you really need to empower people to investigate the wisps of smoke that exist before you have larger failure. And those larger failures come when you haven't actually taken the time to investigate anomalous behavior. And that is an organizational value that I think you can instill, and one that we really sought to preserve through this acquisition, where we would make sure that we continue to investigate anomalous behavior, which allows you to understand the smaller failures before they turn into the bigger ones. I think that people like to talk about how we deal with, the blameless postmortem and so on these larger failures. But then when it's actually time for someone to investigate some strange behavior before they push, behavior that doesn't necessarily affect what they're doing, but understanding that behavior would actually increase their understanding of the system. You want to organizationally really encourage that behavior and encourage them, take a little longer on this, and in return, let's exchange some understanding. And we may understand that, oh my God, our systems are way more vulnerable than we realized. And now we can actually fix this before it becomes an outage. So I think the kind of the way we deal with these things culturally is not just how we deal with an actual outage or an actual failure, but how we actually think of anomalous behavior and root causing that.
I could probably pick up from there, because maybe observing a counter example of how we deal with failure and blame. I was just before I left Australia, so it would have been about 3 years ago. And Telstra, and this is all in the public domain, by the way. This is one of those rare times where I can name people, because this is all public. So Telstra, who were the existing sort of priorly, they were the government-owned monopoly in Australia, still the biggest telco. So they had a big outage, and this outage had impacted internet connectivity, mobile telephony, and sort of fixed line telephony across large parts of Australia. And in a country that is very kind of sparsely populated, there are some sort of rural communities that are really badly affected by these. And it was a big story because it was a significant outage. And I remember it vividly because I was sitting in a coffee shop just around the corner from my house. Very stereotypically Australian. I was sitting in a coffee shop, and this report came out in the Sydney Morning Herald saying that Telstra had come up with an announcement, and they said, we don't know what caused the outage. We haven't yet fully investigated it, but what we do know is that an individual didn't follow proper procedure and caused this problem. So I love this. This is a statement from the COO, right? There's a C-level exec saying, we don't know what caused it. We haven't done an investigation yet, but what we do know is an individual did something wrong. So the kind of immediately you're going through, okay, so firstly, you're saying the major telco of a large industrialized nation is built in such a way that an individual making a mistake can bring the whole thing down. So basically you're saying, your systems are shit. And secondly, you're saying you don't actually really want to investigate what's going on. And thirdly, you clearly operate a blame culture in the biggest possible way. And so I sort of wrote a few tweets about this and said, look, firstly, maybe you should find out what happened. Secondly, blaming an individual is probably not a good way to create a good culture internally. Thirdly, if your system's blah, blah, blah. I said this got picked up by a couple of journalists, and I got a phone call from one of them saying, can you do some quotes for me for a piece? I think it was in the Financial Review or something like that. Australia's actually a weirdly small place, so it wasn't that out of the ordinary to get a call from a journalist or something like this. And they said, so I'm not an expert in telcos, but I have actually done some work looking into sort of failures in systems. You should talk to other people. I think I suggested go talk to Sidney Decker or something, but I suspect he was full. His diary was full at the time. And so I sort of said, here's here's how we should think about these. And I don't think it's very good for, and I also made the point that if you worked at Telstra, you come into work the next day, how are you going to feel? Because a large amount of Telstra would know who that individual is. It's not that hard to find it out. So I shared all this publicly. And then two kind of interesting things happened. The first was I got a phone call from my boss who said, so my good friend Ryan, and Ryan goes, Sam. I go, hi Ryan, how are you? He says, I'm good. Good, thanks, Sam. Telstra. I said, yeah. I know Telstra. He says, I see you've been in the news. I say, yeah. Well, like it when I do these sorts of things. It's good. And he goes, yeah. They're a big customer, don't you? And I'm like, no. They're not a customer anymore, are they, Ryan? Because we stopped working with them. And they're like, no, they're still a big customer, Sam. And I'm like, oh, crap. So that went bad. But then weirdly enough, despite this massive outage being caused at Telstra by that one individual, and I assume that individual was, I don't know, crucified upside down or something to appease the C-level execs, Telstra had multiple systemic failures over the next 12 to 18 months that must have been caused by other rogue individuals doing things badly. And of course, this repeats itself. I mean, we saw a similar thing happen recently, well, a couple of years ago now, when British Airways' systems went down, the booking systems went down, and the blame was pointed at a contractor doing something incorrectly regarding power, the allegation being that he unplugged a data center. Again, how you can make that happen, I don't know. But again, that was an excuse used publicly. So you get some great, fantastic counter examples of that in the public sphere.
Oh, I think you might have frozen, Sam. Oh no, you're back. Thank you. Any follow-up to Sam's story?
Well, it's interesting because in the aviation industry, it used to be that pilot's error was something that a lot of accidents were attributed to pilot's error. And it's something they learned to no longer do that, because that is basically just saying we are no longer going to look at this actual faulty plane or whatever. It was one of the major improvements they made to plane safety, was saying pilot error is your excuse of absolute last resort. You should never use it normally. Look for everything else first. Yeah, it's interesting. We haven't quite learned that yet. Obviously, interestingly, BA, as you pointed out, was somebody who did the same thing when it came to their tech data centers.
It reminds me of a story I once heard. I might butcher this, but it was a lecture somewhere where the lecturer asked the class. No, it wasn't. Sorry, it wasn't university. It was an industry event. So a bunch of people who already worked in the industry, and he asked them, "How many of you would get in a plane running software built by your company?" And only one hand went up. And he said, "Why would you get in that plane?" He said, "Because if my company built it, I'm 100% sure it wouldn't even take off." But I think, a lot of these things, so obviously things go wrong. And I think there is a natural sort of, there's a natural understanding barrier, So when we start talking about things like how that's reported in the press, obviously that's gone through a bunch of PR to get there, because it's probably a message they know half of the public will be okay with. Obviously, when we look at it from the inside out, we're like, how can that be happening? But within the company itself, I think a lot of these interesting problems, or at least the reactions to them, which create, cultures where you have to steal non-competes, or cultures where you're kind of trying to retain a blame-free culture after an acquisition, really come from very natural tensions within a business, right? People always want to go faster. They're always damaging you in some way. The developers would often like to fix all the technical debt. Product would often like to ship all the features. And I think, in my experience, really what it comes down to is leadership, and some way of saying all these things are important, but somehow we need to decide which are most important and when. And I know, Sam, that you spend a lot of time talking about the technology of microservices, but of course, it's also an organizational idea. I mean, does that come up often there? Product management, technical debt, all that kind of stuff? Was it really more just about distributing the software?
Well, there is a bit of a false dichotomy there that you didn't state, and I don't think you're going to, but that we do have in the back of our minds, which is that you can either go fast and break stuff or go slow and steady and it'll be okay. And we've actually found that that's just not the case. You know, in general, if you certainly look at the output of the kind of work done behind the state of DevOps reports over many, many years, they've shown a very, very strong correlation between the frequency of delivery and the defect rates, to the extent where organizations which ship software more quickly tend to have lower defect rates. Because it turns out if you go fast and keep breaking stuff, you don't have a business anymore. But if you go fast, you get good at doing things well and doing things effectively and efficiently. So I think sometimes it's a bit of a false dichotomy. But yeah, there's always trade-offs, and some of those trade-offs I think are healthy. I mean, for me, the biggest challenge I face talking about building systems which are more resilient and creating systems that are more robust and creating organizations which are more resilient is the expectation that this stuff comes for free. And so when I'm working with companies that say, I want to use microservices, it's like, well, my default position is you have to convince me it's a good reason. And if it's not, I'm going to tell you not to do it. And they'll say, it's because it will be more resilient. I say, well, okay, firstly, resiliency is way more than just your software. It's how you act and you behave. So what are you doing to change that? It doesn't come for free. And actually, a lot of what we could do to improve things would be nothing to do with your systems architecture. It would be down to creating a safe culture internally to encourage learning and feedback. And, having some backups. Sometimes it's really basic stuff, but people want the shiny technology to solve their problems. And I said, all you're doing really is potentially with a microservice architecture, you're increasing the number of options you have about how to build a more robust system. But you're also drastically increasing your surface area of failure. You're making your systems more complex and therefore harder to understand. And when systems are harder to understand, it's even harder to understand what's going to happen if something goes wrong or to fix something when it does go wrong. And so I'm always, if their main driver is, I want to make my systems more robust, I'm extremely, I tend to say, well, okay, well, let's deal with all those fundamental things before we even look at making your system more distributed.
So it's an interesting point. And if we talk about having a resilient culture or a culture that's able to be resilient because of the way that it deals with failure, I think we can all easily point to companies where that works and companies where it doesn't. But I'm wondering if we can, as a panel, identify some behaviors, either from leaders or team members or anybody else, that actually, because as far as I'm aware, culture is really just the sort of collection of all the behaviors. So how do you get the right behaviors, and what are they?
I would say, and this is a terrible one, really, because there's not always a great deal you can do about this. Companies that I have found easy, pleasant to work for are generally companies that are not failing. If you're running out of money, once a company is running out of money, once something terrible happens, then everything goes out the window. It's very unusual. So Jamie's talk this morning was fantastic because he dealt with everything in the right way, but very few companies do. And usually it goes into a complete meltdown if there isn't money coming in, and then you suddenly get terrible, crazy decisions coming down from on high. So I remember one company I worked for, I was working for an international online lingerie company during the financial crisis, during the financial collapse. Everything went down. Basically, the pants fell out of the lingerie. It's a discretionary purchase. Everyone stopped buying fancy lingerie overnight, and we went into complete meltdown. And unfortunately, we didn't have Jamie with a good view of why we were doing it and what we were doing in charge. So it was massive redundancies. It was crazy schemes to keep things going, and it was extremely stressful and difficult to do the right thing.
Thanks, Anne. Anybody else want to touch on sort of behaviors they've seen, or perhaps patterns for cultures that are better at this?
I think that, the tone very much comes from the top, and it very much comes from your executive leadership. And it's not impossible to build a terrific culture underneath poor executive leadership, but it is very, very challenging. It's much easier when that executive leadership can really set the tone. And for me, the kind of the litmus test for an executive, for a CEO and so on, is how do you deal with bad news? And because there's a lot of bad news here in reality. Things don't always go as we want it to go. And the best execs really seek that out almost. They want to be sure that they understand that they hear the bad news first, that they hear it candidly, and that then they were, as an organization, able to rectify the underlying problem. In order to be able to do that, you need to have a culture that's not based on fear, that really kind of embraces that kind of candor, embraces that kind of transparency. But I found that that's when you get an actual resilient organization, because when people discover something that is, wow, like, ooh, God, I just discovered something that is pretty serious, they are culturally encouraged to share that and rectify it rather than burying it because no one wants to accommodate bad news.
Yeah, I was recently rereading Weinberg's, what is it, Systems Thinking Part 1, and he shares a story in there. This is a book from like '89. He shares a story about a CTO or a CEO who mandated that there shall be no more bugs until Christmas. And of course, there were no more bugs reported until Christmas. And I think that's the point, is that you need a certain amount of candor because there's going to be shit everywhere. And you'd probably be better off knowing about it than sort of scaring it away. Anyone else want to add anything to that from the sort of behavior culture?
Well, I feel like right now and for the past very short period of time, I want to say maybe 10 years out, but more in the recent 5 years, leadership has shifted from mandations to listening. And it's finally mainstream. And these companies that are like, of course, the stress of going under is going to mean that an entire company is going to become desperate. But even as recently as 15 years ago, most of the large successful companies were mandate companies with a mandate culture. And it's only very recently that leadership has started listening and being vulnerable. The actual psychological safety has become more common, which is beautiful for people like me who would be, I'm wearing a mask, but I normally don't wear a mask. I'm very transparent. It's normally my thing. And I would get very uncomfortable very fast at places because I would tell the truth. And it used to be that people didn't want to hear the truth. It's one of the reasons I'm happy I moved to the Netherlands from the States. I had a filter on my mouth all the time until I moved here. And the Dutch culture is very open, is very honest, as will just tell you like it is. It doesn't matter if you're a junior engineer or a senior engineer, they will tell you what's wrong. And I don't know if that's a recent thing or not. But yeah, that's kind of the opposite of a horror story. I love where we are now. There's a lot of hate as well, but I feel like the big tech companies, the successful tech companies, are starting to be a lot more open, and it's beautiful.
I can tell you, Ryan, having moved to Amsterdam in 2005, that it's at least 15 years old, with the Dutch being very candid all the time. And when I first got there, I was like, this is horrible. I want to go back to England where everyone hides their emotions. But I got used to it, and it was much better.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that I take advantage of one thing that I don't normally have in a panel, which is that we have an actual ethicist in the room with us today. Normally that isn't the case. And I'm wondering, Anne, if you could tell us from an ethical point of view, if this actually has any bearing. Like, does it matter from an ethical point of view if everyone's miserable as long as we, make money? Or is there a more nuanced way of looking at this through that lens?
Well, there's been a lot of research done on this because a lot of research done on this that came out of the the financial crisis that caused so much trouble for me in the lingerie business, there was a lot of research went into why the finance business industry became so unethical that caused all of those problems. So loads and loads of work done there. And they looked into what needed to happen for an industry to not do that, to behave well. And they looked into, is it the senior managers? Do they need to be better behaved? Because if they are, they set the example, is that what makes it work? And the conclusion was no. And is it the kind of the junior developers, the young folk? No. Is it having an ethical manifesto or something like that? So the conclusion was no, it has no effect whatsoever. The thing that does have an effect is pretty much exactly the same as the safety culture, which is that you have to have middle managers who are happy to say when they don't like something and set the example. So as long as you've got the middle of your company is ethical, then the rest of your company will be ethical as well. And there are various other senior managers can help with that, but fundamentally it's about convincing the middle that they have the power and the authority to go with their own internal judgment, which is usually pretty good, to do the right thing. But that's very easily upset. And it is fundamentally safety culture. It's the same, whether you're deciding to do the right thing or the wrong thing, technically or ethically, it's pretty much the same. Your gut's pretty good on those things.
So then that leads me to a question, which is how would we interview for this? Like I've found in my career that it's very difficult to change people. So the easiest thing you can do is get the right people on the way in, but that's also a huge problem. So does anybody have any experience with interviewing explicitly for these kind of character traits that would lead to a safer organization or better responses to failures, resiliency, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so at Oxide, we are very explicit about our values, and we interview very much around those values. So that our process actually has people submit written materials, which includes both a portfolio of work, things that they're proud of, and so on. But then we also ask people some introspective questions. We ask them, when have you been happiest in your career and why? When have you been unhappiest in your career and why? Take one of we've got 15 values. Take one of these values. When was it particularly exhibited in your career? And describe that. Take another one of these values. When was it particularly violated in your career? How did you deal with that? Take two of these values. When did they come into tension for you? How did you resolve that tension? And the answers we get are just amazing. These are super simple questions. They're very basic, but boy, does character reveal itself when people are, especially when you're being asked to write it down. When you're being asked to write it down, it's not merely, your performance on an oral exam. It's a take-home exam, and you can take your time on it. And people think really thoughtfully. I've had people, I've had people say who did not matriculate to Oxide that the process was very helpful for them to figure out what they wanted to do next, which is interesting because these questions they do reveal character. And we very much interview on character. Character is extremely important to us. And I think that you can interview for it. And I think people make a mistake when they don't.
And I think it's also incredibly important if you are the interviewee to ask those same questions, because you want to know that you're entering into a psychologically safety space as well. I specifically, when I was looking for work, I would ask the person interviewing me, when have you made a mistake in the company you work for? How did it go? What did you learn? What did you do? And if they're like, oh, haha, nothing, then I'm like, bye. But if there's a dialogue there where I admit a mistake and you admit a mistake, okay, I know I could work here.
I remember I used to work at a consultancy company called ThoughtWorks, and I was there for about 12, 13 years in the end. And they always had an explicit, there was always sort of cultural questions woven into the whole interview process but there was also an explicit cultural interview. And it was where these issues were going to be raised. So it was sort of woven through. And I think it starts even earlier than the interview process, by the way. I think it also starts in how you write job ads, how you have conversations with people before they even apply. I think coming back to that Rain's point, like you've got to ask the questions as the person joining a company, that also how you engage with those adverts that you're looking at is already start that process. So if you're a company putting these adverts out there, you're already sharing parts of yourself externally. The really interesting things that you would see with the cultural interviews would be, quite often we would have situations where quite senior people in the cultural interview, we would have them interviewed by people that had maybe less experienced. So you'd have someone that's like going to be a program manager being interviewed by people who've been in the company for a couple of years that had training on how to do the interview process well. But a lot of it was about how you have that dialogue and create, we're not trying to artificially create a gotcha situation, but just seeing how people reacted in those situations in terms of how they'd interpret it. There's also, though, a lot of that stuff is really subtle. I remember in Australia, you'd ask the office manager, and they could tell you with nearly a 99.9% accuracy when someone turned up in reception, whether or not they were going to get offered or whether or not they were going to pass a cultural stage just by talking to them. And there was some very easy, and so after you'd get to write it down, you wouldn't ask her before you made the offer, but she was unerringly accurate at this because you'd get people that would turn up and would just treat the people on the reception desk like shit. It's like, next, right? How on earth do you think that's going to work? But there were some easy filtering mechanisms there. And so there is also, I think, part of that interview process is making sure that you've also had a rounded selection of people have had a chance to spend time with them. And I think obviously that's more difficult at a larger company. It ends up creating for a longer interview process. And that was often, I know, something that was quite frustrating for people that were joining the company at the time, but it was still important. When you're a 4 or 5 person company, everyone can speak to you. It's more difficult. You start ending up to trust your colleagues on that.
Thanks, Sam. So we have 13 minutes left. We've covered a broad range of topics, and I always wish there was some way to have like a nice conclusion, but unfortunately these subjects are a little too complex. So what I wanted to do instead to wrap up is ask each of you to choose 1 or 2 elements of this conversation we've had today, and to tell the people at home, if they wanted to know more about it, what should they go watch, read, listen to, who should they follow on Twitter, etc., etc. So maybe start with Bryan over on the left.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think we kind of touched on the values in an organization. I thought Rain made an excellent point about when you are a candidate, asking the people you're speaking with about their values to understand to what degree that's a fit. One of the things that we actually do is I describe those introspective questions. Everyone in the company has answered those same questions. When a candidate is having interviews, they get the answers of all of the people they're speaking with, which has been created a really interesting dynamic, right? To your point about wanting to understand when other people, what made them happy, what made them unhappy. I think that, I would perhaps selfishly vector folks on this kind of subject of values, which is incredibly core to me and very important to us at Oxide. I would vector people to 2 talks that, again, selfishly I gave, but one on Amazon's leadership principles, which I've put in giant pig air quotes there. They're really not principles at all, or values. But I gave a presentation at Oktoberfest in 2017 on that. And that still remains the only talk that I have asked friends and family to watch, because I think building a values-based organization is something that we can all do in all of our domains. And it's something that I agree with Rainey that I'm optimistic that things are changing, but they're not changing quickly enough. And we have too many organizations that don't carry themselves the way they should in the world, because they don't know what their organizational values are. So I would vector people to that. And then I think closer to home, and for those of us in software, I think that we are making values-based decisions all the time when we pick and deploy projects, open source projects, even using proprietary software, using services. We are making values-based decisions. And I gave a talk called The Platform is a Reflection of Values that talks about how each software platform has its own values. And it doesn't mean that we often get this kind of false dichotomy of one being better than another. And actually what you're saying is the values this platform has are a better fit for the values that I'm seeking in this particular problem. And I think that it's important to be explicit about that. So I would vector people to probably those two talks.
Thanks, Bryan. Sam, any resources you'd send people to?
Yeah, I think there's two talks that I come back to a lot that I learned a lot from in this space. I say the first one would be a talk by Sidney Dekker. So Sidney Dekker was an airline pilot, went into sort of air traffic investigations. He's now based in Australia. He looks into kind of how you build systems that have lower failure rates. He works with like surgeons, stuff like that. He did a great talk for DevOps Days Brisbane. I'll share a link. I don't know how the best. I'm putting a link in the chat. And I'll tweet this link out. It's a great talk all about the concept of failure. Mm-hmm. His view is that we started off blaming individuals at the time of Adam and Eve, which, depending on your religious leanings is questionable. But it's a really interesting kind of discussion about how this idea of us wanting to blame people is something we've done for a very, very long period of time, but also talks about how flawed it is. The other talk I was going to share was by Rin Daniels, and it's a talk I saw them do at CodeFest in New Zealand. And talking about sort of Rin's experiences of working at Etsy at the time and how they created a culture of learning and a culture of safety. I'm going to try and dig out a link to that video as well, and I'll make sure to share that as well via Twitter, and I'll tag the Software Circus. But both of those talks were excellent, and I like, I would find time for both, but Sydney's talk especially I'd had conversations with John Allsport before. But as I've had, and he's a person definitely worth following. But I've had not arguments, but he can be a bit academic. So I always like to make it more practical. And I thought the Sydney's talk was fantastic because it took topics and made them very concrete and very, very sort of real. So I'd thoroughly recommend that talk, especially when it just comes to just dealing with that fundamental issue of talking about how nonsensical it is to blame an individual for failure. And I think once you deal with that and process that, a lot of other things can flow. So I'll share a link to those two talks on Twitter, and I'll tag in the Software Circus Fest.
That's great. Thanks, Sam. And for the almost 110 at last count people watching, now's a great time to drop questions into the QA and chat. We may have time for a couple at the end. Up next, going left to right, as I see it, Anne, any recommendations for books or resources?
So Bryan and Sam have made some excellent suggestions so far, and again, I would back that up. It's all about psychological safety, not looking at systems, not individuals. If you want to take on another beyond the aviation industry, is obviously going to get lots of discussion in this because they're so far ahead in safety and preventing disaster. Drift into Failure is a good book, often recommended by Adrian Cockcroft. I think is one of his favorites, about how problems kind of rack up over time. And it's not about individuals, it's about complex systems just build up a great deal of error until they explode if you don't look into it and work out what those errors are. So Drift into Failure, very good.
Thank you, Anne. Last but by no means least, Rain, any recommendations for us?
I'm, by the way, I'm 44 years old. I had an entire dance career, 20 years, and I just found myself in tech about 15 years ago. And when I joined tech, it was because I loved coding. And so pretty much my only requirement for a job was that I was coding. And through the years, I've added little bits to those requirements, but it's taken literally 15 years to find my happy space, and that's too long. it's too long. And so my advice is to figure out your happy space and then go for it. Start interviewing for those jobs with which are at the companies that actually do have a great standards and great culture. Start going after that industry that makes you happy, and work on yourself. If you're not there yet, if you're not fully qualified, start reading the books that are recommended to you. Start failing and making mistakes and figuring things out. And I feel like I just started figuring that out at 44, which is maybe late, or maybe it's early and I've still got another 44 years to go. But I'd like for anyone younger than me to listen to that. Figure out what makes you happy and then go do it.
Thank you, Rain. Really appreciate that. And I'm glad to hear that you're in your happy place now, because we're working together. So that's good. Okay, I'm going to throw one in there, which is a podcast that I come back to every single week, and it touches on a lot of different things. It's got a bit of a misnomer title. It's called Troubleshooting Agile, and it's by Jeffrey Frederick and Douglas Squirrel. The thing is, it's got nothing to do with Agile, or at least hardly ever. It's about all the things around culture and behavior and psychology that kind of make a high-functioning software team. It's 15 minutes every week, which is perfect for me, and I always get something out of it. So I'll throw that one in the ring, sorry. We didn't get any questions, but we did get a whole bunch of suggestions in there in the chat. We also got a lot of praise and support. I think people have responded to this really well. So thank you for that. I'm just going to give you a few shout outs for what's coming up next. So that is the end of the panel. We will say a proper thank you in a moment. Before that, we have many more things coming up today. So we've got 5 more hours of content, amazingly. I feel like I've been doing this for several weeks already. If you joined the Brella app, you will automatically have been added to the 200 t-shirt raffle. Of course, the contest for the competition is the most hotly contested contest today. So make sure you are taking photos of yourself and tweeting them with the hashtag Software Circus Fest. We'll be picking out the winners at 10 p.m. CET, so 9 o'clock in London. Pumpkin carving. I'm not quite sure when they're doing that, but if you're still carving, you can still win. I think Tom Crow from Equinix is giving out the prize. And then I'm just going to say a couple of thank yous to our sponsors again, which is Equinix Metal, Cycloid, Giant Swarm, Instana, and Kinfolk, all of whom you can find in the sponsor booths. The only thing that's left for me to do is say a huge thank you to our panelists. So thank you, Bryan, Sam, Anne, and Rain today. That was hugely enjoyable. Now I'm going to go and lie down for about 20 minutes and recover. Have a lovely afternoon, everybody, and see you all again later on. Bye-bye.